But when they drove up to the house that Friday, they discovered they no longer had a key, a welcome, or any legal right to step inside. My parents' SUV rolled slowly up the gravel driveway, followed by my sister's minivan and my uncle's pickup. 11 people packed with coolers, beach towels, folding chairs, and the absolute certainty that my home belonged to them. I stood behind the living room window, my feverish son asleep against my husband's shoulder. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional cough from upstairs. Outside, I watched my father climb out first, already waving like he owned the place. He smiled until his key stopped turning. Then he tried again. Nothing. My mother looked toward the front porch and frowned. The welcome mat was gone. So were the spare keys hidden beneath the flower pot they thought I didn't know about. My phone vibrated. Dad Mimi opened the door. I read it without moving. Another message appeared. Mom, we're here. For the first time in my life, they were the ones waiting outside, and I was the one deciding whether they came in. I remembered my father's message from 3 days earlier. Friday, all 11 of us are staying at your beach house for the next 2 weeks. Don't let us down. Not a question, not a request, a command. When my husband answered that our little boy was burning with a high fever and we couldn't safely host anyone, they didn't ask how he was doing. They didn't offer help. My mother simply replied, "We're coming anyway." As if our child's illness was an inconvenience, as if our home wasn't ours, as if the word no had never applied to them. So I had answered with one quiet word, "All right." They thought it meant surrender. It actually meant I had 48 hours to make sure they would never mistake my silence for permission again. My name is Claire, and I inherited the beach house from my grandmother, the only person in my family who ever believed kindness didn't require surrender. She left it to me because I was the one who repaired the porch after storms, paid the taxes when she fell behind, and sat beside her hospital bed long after everyone else had gone home. The rest of my family remembered the house only when summer arrived. My father talked about it as if it were still part of his empire. He loved introducing it as our family beach house, conveniently forgetting that the deed carried only my name. Correcting him always led to the same tired smile, the one that suggested I was being dramatic instead of accurate. Growing up, I learned that keeping the peace meant giving things away. My room to visiting relatives, my weekends to family plans, my opinions to whoever spoke the loudest. Saying no was treated like betrayal, while sacrificing my own needs was praised as maturity. Even after I married my husband, Daniel, the pattern continued. They called him polite because he rarely argued, but what they really admired was how easily they assumed they could ignore us both. Then our son was born. Something changed the first time I held him through a sleepless night. Listening to his tiny breaths and realizing that protecting him mattered more than preserving anyone else's comfort. When my parents dismissed his high fever as an obstacle to their vacation, they unknowingly crossed the one boundary I no longer intended to erase. They still believed I was the daughter who would always step aside. They had no idea I had already decided that version of me would never answer the door again. For years, my parents had mastered a particular kind of disrespect. It never arrived as an explosion. It came wrapped in certainty, spoken with calm voices that left no room for disagreement. Every summer they announced plans instead of asking. My father would tell relatives, "We'll stay at Claire's place," before I had even heard about the trip. By the time someone mentioned it to me, refusing would have meant embarrassing everyone else, and somehow that responsibility always landed on my shoulders. When they visited, they rearranged furniture because they preferred Better Flow, my mother, replaced the groceries. I bought with brands she liked, then laughed as though she were doing me a favor. My father would hand my husband a list of repairs without ever asking whether we had other plans, speaking in the same measured tone he had used when Daniel was still just my boyfriend. The smallest moments stayed with me the longest. A quick glance exchanged across the dinner table whenever I disagreed. A patient smile that suggested I was overreacting before I had finished speaking. Conversations that continued straight through my answers, as though my words had been little more than background noise. Even after our son was born, nothing changed. When I asked everyone to wash their hands before holding the baby, my mother hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. Then she sighed dramatically, walked to the sink without a word, and made sure the silence felt like an accusation instead of a simple request. My father watched the exchange, folded his newspaper with careful precision, and murmured, Young parents worry about everything. Nobody laughed. Nobody defended us either. That quiet acceptance told me more than any argument ever could. In my family, disrespect didn't need raised voices. It only needed enough people willing to pretend they hadn't seen it. The message, "We're coming anyway," should have made me angry. Instead, it made everything strangely clear. I read it twice while sitting beside my son's bed, pressing a cool cloth against his forehead. His cheeks were flushed, his breathing uneven, and every few minutes he reached for my hand without opening his eyes. Down the hall, Daniel was calling the pediatrician's after-hours line, speaking in the low, steady voice he used whenever he was worried but didn't want to frighten me. My phone buzzed again. Not to ask how our little boy was doing, not to offer to postpone the trip, just another reminder of what time they expected to arrive. That was the moment I understood something I had been avoiding for years. This wasn't a misunderstanding. They knew our answer. They simply believed their plans mattered more. I looked around the house my grandmother had trusted me to protect. Every room held memories she had left in my care, not as a vacation property for whoever demanded it first, but as a home meant to be respected. For years, I had mistaken compliance for kindness. I thought if I stayed patient long enough, they would eventually return the consideration I kept giving them. They never did. I turned to Daniel and asked, "If we don't let them in, are you with me?" He didn't hesitate. Completely. That quiet certainty settled every doubt I still had. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had every exterior lock replaced. I disabled the old garage code, removed the hidden spare key, and sent one final message into the family group chat. "We told you we can't host anyone. If you come, you'll need to arrange somewhere else to stay." No threats, no insults, just a boundary they had never believed I would enforce. And for the first time in my life, I had no intention of explaining it twice. I wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. I wanted to remove every excuse they could use to claim they had been misled. Fortunately, years of working as a contract administrator had taught me one lesson that carried well beyond the office. Assumptions create conflict, but documentation ends arguments. Before doing anything else, I reviewed the property records. The beach house was exactly what I already knew it was, legally mine, with no shared ownership, no family trust, and no hidden agreement giving anyone else the right to stay there. I saved screenshots of the group chat, my father's order, my husband's message explaining our son's high fever, my mother's reply, "We're coming anyway," my own response telling them, plainly, that we could not host. Then I called the local locksmith who replaced every exterior lock that afternoon. While he worked, I updated the smart security system, deleted every old access code, and created temporary codes that only Daniel and I could use. The security cameras already covered the driveway and every entrance, but I checked each one to make sure they were recording correctly. Finally, I called our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, a retired school principal who had lived beside the beach house for nearly 20 years. She had watched my grandmother protect that property with quiet determination and understood exactly why I was setting boundaries now. I didn't ask her to intervene. I simply told her that unexpected relatives might arrive despite being told not to. She nodded once and smiled. "Good," she said. "People who ignore a closed door usually need to see that someone else noticed it was closed." By Thursday evening, everything was finished. Nothing dramatic had happened. That was the point. The strongest position is often the quietest one, the one that leaves no confusion about where the line is and no opportunity for someone else to redraw it. Friday afternoon arrived with bright sunshine, the kind of weather my family always described as perfect. Beach house weather, inside. The curtains were half drawn to keep the bedrooms cool, and the only sounds were the dishwasher humming softly and my son's breathing, finally slower than it had been the night before. Then the convoy appeared at the end of the driveway. Through the camera feed on my phone, I watched my father stride confidently to the front door while everyone else unloaded, coolers and luggage as though check-in had already happened. He smiled, reached beneath the flower pot for the spare key, and paused when his hand found nothing but concrete. He tried his old key. It didn't move. His shoulders stiffened. My mother walked up beside him, whispered something, and he entered the garage code with deliberate confidence. The keypad flashed red, once, then again. Silence settled over the driveway in a way I had never seen before. Nobody complained. Nobody laughed. They simply looked toward the house, waiting for someone else to explain why certainty had stopped working. My phone rang. I let it ring. A text followed. "The key doesn't work." I replied only once. I know. A few minutes later came another message. Where are we supposed to stay? I looked at my sleeping son curled against Daniel on the sofa, then back at the camera showing 11 adults standing in the afternoon sun beside their own luggage. For the first time, the inconvenience belonged to the people who had created it. I locked my phone, made my son another glass of water, and let the quiet inside the house answer every message I chose not to send. The lesson wasn't delivered with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrived with something my family had never expected from me, a boundary that stayed exactly where I had placed it. They didn't stay in the driveway forever. After nearly an hour of phone calls and tense conversations beside their cars, they started loading the luggage back into the trunks. My sister eventually found a hotel with enough vacant rooms for everyone, though it cost far more than they had expected to spend. From the security camera, I watched them drive away one by one, not defeated so much as forced to confront a reality they had never planned for. The family group chat came alive that evening. Some relatives called me stubborn. Others insisted I should have made an exception, because everyone had already made the trip. A few stayed completely silent, which told me they understood more than they were willing to admit publicly. Then something unexpected happened. My aunt, the one who almost never challenged my father, sent me a private message. You warned them. They chose not to listen. It was only one sentence, but it broke years of feeling like I was the only person seeing what had been happening. Over the following weeks, the invitations and announcements changed. Instead of telling me where people would be staying, relatives began asking whether a visit worked for us. Some still didn't like my answer when it was no, but they had finally learned that no wasn't the beginning of a negotiation. My relationship with my parents grew quieter after that. Not warmer, not closer, just more honest. They no longer confused access with love, and I no longer confused obedience with respect. Looking back, I don't remember the locked door as the most important part of that weekend. I remember my son sleeping peacefully inside, while the pressure to betray my own boundaries remained outside. Sometimes the strongest act of love isn't opening your home. It's protecting the people already inside it. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. There was no dramatic apology, no emotional family meeting where everyone suddenly understood my point of view. Real life rarely offers endings that tidy. Instead, the change came in small, unmistakable ways. My parents stopped announcing their plans and started asking, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes through clipped text messages, but they asked. When I said a date didn't work, they no longer assumed persistence would change my answer. That was enough. I also changed in ways that surprised me. I no longer felt the need to explain every boundary as if I were asking permission to have one. No became a complete sentence instead of the beginning of a long defense. The guilt I had carried for years slowly gave way to something steadier. Confidence. I finally understood that protecting my peace wasn't an act against my family. It was an act for the family Daniel and I were building together. Our son recovered within a few days, and before long he was back to chasing seagulls along the shoreline, laughing as the waves chased his little feet. Watching him run across the same beach my grandmother had loved reminded me why she had trusted me with the house in the first place. She hadn't left me a vacation destination. She had left me a responsibility to care for a place where love felt safe, never demanded. Sometimes I still think about that Friday afternoon, not because my parents were left searching for hotel rooms, not because the locks kept them out, but because for the first time, I looked through that front window and recognized the woman looking back at me. She wasn't afraid of disappointing people who refused to respect her. She wasn't measuring her worth by how much she could sacrifice. She had finally learned that peace isn't something other people give you. It's something you protect, one quiet decision at a time. And every time I lock the front door now, I don't think about keeping people out. I think about keeping the right people safe inside.